So yeah, I'd like to speak to you today about the work we're doing to build a federal public service accessibility strategy. Our office was established in August 2018 when our Deputy Minister, Yasmine Laroche, was named in the role of Deputy Minister of Public Service Accessibility. It was the first time that any Government of Canada Deputy Minister was named in this role. The Prime Minister named Yasmine Laroche in this role to help the Government of Canada get ready for Bill C-81, which is the Accessible Canada Act. So I will flip to the next slide that gives you a little bit of context on the Accessible Canada Act, which is a piece of legislation that is currently before the Senate. It's gone through the House of Commons and is now being considered by the Senate of Canada. So as I was saying, Deputy Minister Yasmine Laroche was named in this role, and she has created a very small team of 13 people, many of whom have lived experience of disability, visible and invisible. And we've been charged with engaging federal public servants and disability stakeholders in the design and development of this strategy. So we have this ambitious and wonderful mandate to develop a vision for the Government of Canada and develop a plan for how we're going to deliver and kind of get closer to that vision. So the vision that we have developed for now, that we're workshopping with public servants and with stakeholders outside of government, is to become the most accessible and inclusive public service in the world. So wouldn't that be amazing that the Government of Canada could become the most inclusive and accessible public service in the world? So we, to get the conversation started with federal public servants, especially those with lived experience of disability, but also allies who don't have lived experience of disability, and also folks who don't necessarily self-identify as having a disability, because we all have a role to play in creating inclusive and accessible workplaces. So we wrote a presentation, a little bit like the one that I'm presenting today, to get some ideas going, to sort of elicit feedback, both in person but also online. This was our starting point, and we launched it on December 3rd, International Day of Persons with Disabilities. We talked in that about the vision, as I just mentioned, and also the principles that will guide our work. And we also talked about the work that lies ahead in the Government of Canada in the 6 pillars that are identified in the legislation, Bill C-81. So I'm just, sorry, I'm not. So you'll see these are the 6 pillars that are identified in Bill C-81. And so the way we structured our initial conversation is to talk about what is the current state of employment, for example, in the Government of Canada for persons with disabilities? What's our desired state? What do we want our workplace to look like for people with disabilities in terms of employment? And what are the priorities for action to get from where we currently are to where we want to go? And what are the measures of success? What will we get? How will we know that we're advancing in the way that we want to be advancing? So you may know, some of you may know, that the Government of Canada is the largest employer in Canada. And some of the data sources that we have access to, like the annual Public Service Accessibility, or the annual Public Service Employee Survey, indicates that there are significant concerns for persons with disabilities working in the federal public service. For example, rates of harassment are at 37% for people who self-identify as having a disability, compared to 17% of those who do not self-identify. So there's a lot of work that we need to do and to address and rectify this situation. So we know that our research, so as I was saying, this is a bit of a slide showing the desired state and some priorities for action to get to that place. And these were presented, and they're presented today just as ideas to get the conversation started. So we know that the research that we've done since we were established in the fall isn't comprehensive. We know that we know a little bit more about the employment pillar, for example, than we do about the transportation pillar. So we designed an iterative process to hear from more and more people in the federal government, but also outside the federal government, to inform and refine our current state, our desired state, our priorities for action, and our measures of success. And we're hoping to do that by the spring and have a more completed strategy at that time. So this is why we've been spending a lot of time over the last few months, and will continue to spend a lot of time in the next few months engaging groups like the Open Government Forum, among many others. We want to learn from others, and we want to make the necessary changes to remove barriers. So we want to hear from other people's experiences. So I know that we had some. I'm going to try to that our process involves, going out and hearing from deputy ministers across the Government of Canada, engaging them in this project of inclusion and accessibility. Our deputy minister is hosting town halls with public servants across the country. She did one in Vancouver. Next week she's doing one in Montreal. So we're meeting with colleagues in all regions of Canada to hear firsthand from people who have lived experience of disability and how to improve what the Government of Canada is doing as an employer, but also as a service provider. So we look forward to more conversations. We have Chairs and Champions of Persons with Disabilities Committee that's composed of all government players, all government departments and agencies. So that's a place where we've been doing a lot of workshops. We did one in December. There's another one coming up in March. And so there are a lot of opportunities for people who have disabilities to share their concerns and have them reflected in the strategy going forward.
Our next speaker, I'm going to do a very short recap of what I just previously spoke about in the intro, simply because I feel like some of the stuff that I said is somewhat important, so I'll make it very brief. The webinar series today is part of a series that the Government of Canada is hosting in collaboration with the Open Government Partnership on Inclusion. As many of you may know, the Government of Canada is currently chairing or co-chairing the Open Government Partnership, and we've established together with our co-chair Nathaniel Heller 3 priorities: inclusion, participation, and impact. This webinar series is going to cover inclusion, and really the idea is that when we open government, we need to open government for all peoples, regardless of their accessibility needs, their membership in a community that may have been traditionally marginalized. So the kinds of topics that we'll be discussing through this webinar are today: accessibility. We'll be speaking about youth inclusion, gender inclusion, and inclusion from an Indigenous perspective. So a big thank you to Katrina from the Open Government Partnership and Natalia from the Government of Canada for their leadership in organizing this session. I will turn now to our next speaker. Because we did have a little bit of a delay, I'll leave all the questions for the end. So please save up your questions. Feel free to put them in the chat function, and we'll take them at the end. Our next speaker is Solomon Kusiampofo. He is a program coordinator at Friends of the Nation based in Ghana. It's a social and environmental advocacy NGO, and he has been actively involved in the co-creation process for Open Government Action Plans, and has been using participatory and innovative approaches in facilitating the participation of underserved communities. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Solomon.
Thank you very much. And I hope everybody can hear me now. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about how Friends of the Nation facilitated the Open Government Partnership Action Plan in the western part of Ghana, and how we actively engage persons with disability in the whole co-creation process. So first of all, I want to take you through what the objectives of the co-creation process was. So the first one was to develop an ambitious and transformative action plan, which reflects the lessons learned from the previous ones and also aligns with the current. The co-creation objectives for Sekenita Kradi was to develop an ambitious and transformative action plan that reflects the lessons learned from the previous action plan and also reflects the current priorities of the Assembly. We also intended to build capacity of government and civil society to be agents of change, and also to do extensive community consultations and also multi-stakeholder engagement and also awareness raising on the action plan once they are produced. So I want to touch on the opportunities for engaging persons with disability in open government. In Ghana, the government passed a local government act in 2016, and that provided opportunity for the inclusion and integration of minorities and also marginalized groups in development planning. So I'll briefly touch on that. So the law states that a district assembly or local government authority shall observe the following principles. One, have special measures of affirmative action for marginalized and minority groups to ensure their enjoyment of equal rights with the rest of the population. Respect for and promotion of the identity and characteristics of minorities. Promotion of diversity and intercultural education. And more importantly, promotion of effective participation of marginalized groups in public and political life. So this provision in the local government law provides the opportunity to include underserved populations in development planning, especially in open government initiatives. So how did we go about in terms of including persons with disability? So the first step was that as we began to do the co-creation process, we formed what we called a working team. So the working team was the technical backstopping team, which was spearheading the co-creation process in terms of coming up with the community engagement strategy, in terms of putting up strategies on how to include stakeholders, and also lead the team in preparing the action plan. And the working team included people from civil society, from the government, and also from underserved communities. And one of the key things that we did was that we formed this 9-member working team for the OGP co-creation process. And as part of the team, we included a representative of the Ghana Federation of Disability Organizations. And as you can see in my presentation, the one that I've circled in red was one who was representing persons with disability. And the mandate of the working team was to review the previous action plan and develop a new engagement strategy, also conduct the community consultations and sensitization meetings, as well as capacity building workshops, then also facilitate the brainstorming sections and also validation of the OGP action plan. So from the start, we included persons with disability in this technical working team. The next step was that as part of the community strategy and consultations, we decided to have a separate engagement with persons with disability to identify their special needs and also let them reflect on what are the priorities in terms of open government for persons with disability. So there was special engagement with them, and one of the key things that we did was that we engaged a diverse group of persons with disability, including physically challenged, the blind, the deaf and dumb, and also included parents of children with intellectual disability. This diversity of group really helped us to articulate or to identify each of the special needs of these groups and also include them in the action plan and also give a sense of inclusion for persons with disability in terms of participating in the co-creation process, articulating their concerns in terms of open government priorities in data. The third step was that we also included about 4 of the 40-member multi-stakeholder forum are also persons with disability. The purpose is to expand the inclusion and also deepen the integration of underserved communities in the whole co-creation process. So at each level of the decision-making process, we make sure that persons with disability are well represented. And as I said, so 4 out of the 40-member multi-stakeholder forum in Sekenita are persons with disability, and they are persons with physically challenged, the blind, one with hearing impairment, and also physically challenged. And the mandate of the multi-stakeholder forum is to facilitate the capacity building sessions for civil society groups and also government on the open government partnership, open government principles, facilitate media engagement, and also contributes in the implementation and also evaluation of the OGP action plan. The third step or the fourth step in engaging the people with disability was also during the community consultations. As I mentioned earlier, we also made sure that persons with disability are also involved in the consultation process at various communities. In all, we visited about 12 communities, and we engaged over 1,141 people, and we made sure that persons with disability are represented at each level of these community consultations so that their needs, their priorities, and also their concerns about open government will also be factored in the action. So what are the lessons learned from this engagement? The first one is that it is easier to engage effectively with well-organized persons with disability groups. So, for example, we in Ghana and also in Sekenita Kwade, we have a well-organized Ghana Federation of Disability Organizations, which is the umbrella organization representing all the different types of disability organizations. That is the blind union, the physically challenged, the deaf and dumb, and also parents, children of intellectual disability. So that helps us in terms of reaching out, because once you have a well-organized organization, then it helps in reaching out to them. The second one is also that it's important to engage the diverse groups of persons with disability to ensure inclusion and also articulation of diverse needs. So as I said, it is important that you don't only target one group, but you ensure that people with physical challenges, people who are blind, people who are deaf and dumb, and also parents with children of intellectual disability are also included in the process. The third point is that it's also imperative to engage persons with disability at all levels of the decision-making process. That's why we started with including them in the technical working team, the multi-stakeholder forum, and also the community consultations. One other key lesson is that engaging persons with disability also needs extra logistics. So, for example, because for the places, some of them we need to pay transportation for them to be able to participate in some of the meetings. We also need to hire an interpreter, especially for people with hearing impairment, that is the deaf, and these are extra logistics that needs to be provided. We also need to make sure that venues that meetings are held are also disability friendly, so that persons with physical disability and also the blind can also participate. The last one is that the action plan must also reflect some of the needs and priorities of persons with disability. And in Sekenita Kwade, the key commitment was in the areas transparency and accountability in the public infrastructure. So make sure that in all public infrastructure that will be built, it is disability friendly. There's also a commitment on civic participation, also fiscal transparency, to ensure the increased inclusion of persons with disability. Then also permitting and enforcement, land use and official plans are also disability inclusive. Access to information, that people with disability can also have access to information. Also on public service, which is sanitation, ensure that people with disability also have better services in sanitation. So this is how we did for the cooperation process, including.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I'll just quickly introduce him. Federico Batista Poitier is the Director of External Relations and Partnerships for the Pineda Foundation and World Enabled. He is a human rights advocate and a disability inclusion advocate with international development experience from virtually everywhere in the world. Federico, I will encourage you to get close to your microphone. It sounds like sound is a bit of a challenge today. Over to you.
All right, so first, how does this sound? Is it okay? Am I loud enough? Okay, good. Well, hello everyone, bonjour à tous. And I'm calling in from Berlin. So it's a bit cold, but I'm pretty sure it's colder in Canada. I wish I was in Ghana at the moment. Thank you for the introduction. I'm the Director of External Relations and Partnerships at World Enabled, and presenting on behalf of Dr. Victor Pineda, who unfortunately got stuck in a delay on a flight to Dubai. World Enabled is an organization focused on basically the principles of universal design within the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And we've also been really engaged at the urban development level. So after 2015, we really pushed through in the new urban agenda. So before I get started on a little bit of how we've been focused on pushing this idea of open government and inclusive processes, is kind of looking at what we need to have a government that is more inclusive. And one step is that the inclusion actually represents all groups. And I think at times, right, the diversity aspect misses the knob on disability. So really looking at, which the convention says as well, that disability is a part of human diversity. And so when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, disability is at the heart of that, especially alongside its gender and age. And how responsive is our government? So how is it responsive to everyone's rights and also their needs and how they can engage into the society? And how do we keep, who is accountable and how do we keep people accountable to really ensure that these processes are inclusive? One of our first best practices, I'll try to give some more practical examples, was during the negotiation process for the New Urban Agenda. And just in case anyone doesn't know, the New Urban Agenda is a guiding document looking at the trends in urbanization, now that we're looking at the majority of the population being in cities by 2050. It's really trying to strategize and ensure that we leave nobody behind, and very aligned with the Sustainable Development Goal 11. We heavily engaged in that process, and in the beginning of the New Urban Agenda, there was just one mention of persons with disabilities, and by joining a group of disability advocates and experts on urban development issues, gender, inclusion, disaster risk reduction, etc., other areas of development, we were able to influence that process to have 15 mentions specifically on persons with disabilities as stakeholders in urban development. So we're heavily engaged in that aspect and also defined an indicator for the New Urban Agenda's success as accessibility. So that's really looking at how the legislative measures can really push inclusion. And this network that we have of disability advocates and organizations represents 200 organizations around the world, and we're doing a lot of research, policy, and also implementation, looking at the technical expertise that's needed, also the research gaps that are in place. And one project that we have the pleasure, I'm not sure if they're on the call yet, but G3ICT is a trusted partner of ours, and we were able to engage industry on this discussion of inclusion by creating a toolkit for city leaders. So this goes into the other aspect of accountability. So when we're looking at development and we're looking at designing for inclusion in open government services, who is held accountable in that sense, and how do we, in a positive way, the more glass half full, bring government and decision makers as well as civil society in the same room to kind of focus in on one aspect. So we did a survey with the chief innovation officers and technology officers around the world in cities like Quito, Barcelona, San Francisco, London, and other cities, and really found that there was, on the topic of digital inclusion, there was a lack of understanding and also the implementation of the standards. And it wasn't the case that cities didn't want to do this. It was more so the fact that what are the tools that we need to do this? You know, I think that in the general sense, we all want to design for inclusion and engage all persons in our development. But you know, how do you do this? What is that roadmap for? So we took in all the feedback we had and designed a toolkit for inclusion called the Smart Cities for All Toolkit, and this was in coordination with G3 ICT and Microsoft as an industry partner and funder, and really bringing a diverse group of stakeholders into the conversation, not only looking at disability groups or offices of persons with disabilities in cities and in member states, but also looking at how industry's role can be in inclusion. And I really like that in this pillar we're looking at in the C81 guidelines that was mentioned earlier is employment. And industry has such a big role in employment, and bringing them to the table and effectively engaging them in the discussions can also present about tools that cities are looking for. So the toolkit has right now 4 series, which is understanding the standards, also how to communicate the case for accessibility. So of course we have this human rights case, and so I'm just reading the notes. So we have the human rights case, but what is the business case for accessibility and inclusion, and what is the technical case? I think that there's so much innovation that goes into thinking in an inclusive way and universal design and designing for inclusion. And then also there is a business case. If you look around the world, we have 15%, and that's probably the low number of persons around the world that identify with disability, and an annual disposable income of persons with disabilities in their family of $9 billion. And when you really present that data to a city and also industry, you know, it makes the case of why we should design for inclusion. Although, you know, on my end, because I'm a human rights, my background's in human rights, the issue of inclusion is at the heart and really important to the social dimension, but we really need to look at those other cases. And then really after this is the procurement, you know, really understanding how our policies are inclusive, and the procurement of, in this case for the Smart Cities work, was the procurement of accessible digital technology, and really creating a model of procurement so that any technology that's coming into a city to be integrated into city services or planning has to be accessible. And then lastly, the last tool we had was a solutions database. So not reinventing the wheel, but there's so many great solutions out there that help achieve objectives that we have on health, on disaster risk reduction, on planning, urban planning issues, and that can be integrated and that are accessible for persons with disabilities. And so these are all different ways that we can think about, you know, really designing for inclusion, and how to effectively get the mainstream stakeholders also at the table, So we're not only having a discussion with about disability, but really about sustainability and designing for all. I can go on for a while, but don't want to take up too much time. So most recently, we've really scaled up our work and the programmatic aspects that we're doing in trying to get cities directly involved, also national governments. But we're really looking at bringing this bottom-up, top-down approach together and meeting in the middle. So we've launched the campaign as of December 3rd with the cities of Berlin, Amman, Sao Paulo, Curitiba, New York City. There's more others, and it's called Cities for All. And we've aligned the commitments to accessibility and universal design within the Sustainable Development Goals, the New Urban Agenda, which I mentioned earlier, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, as a guiding document, but not only to guide, but really create a community of practice with the cities and the civil society organizations and the industry that we've already connected with, and really creating a mechanism in place to create an inclusive system. And so we're now engaging with the cities around the initial year, which will be planning how the monitoring and the implementation of the Global Compact and the Cities for All campaign will be, and also defining some objectives that are shared from already the city's functions. So these are some ways that we're engaging, and we'll be having a global summit in coordination with the United Cities and Local Government Forum, which is an organization that brings together around 4,000 cities in the world. And so we're really trying to bring this more mainstream look at inclusion and universal design, and that it is sustainable design and it meets these objectives that we're shooting for 2030 and even before 2030, to really ensure that we leave no one behind and that our services in cities are inclusive and accessible for everyone. So I'll leave it there, and maybe some questions will come up after. Yeah, sorry that there's no presentation. This was a last minute change, so I can also share some of our resources after with Katrina if the group would like more visual information.
Thank you, Federico. All right, so right now we are going to continue on with the discussion phase of our webinar. So we've received a few questions from our participants. If you have any more questions, feel free to send them in through the chat box. So for Federico, we received like 2 questions from Damaris. And she asked, is there any monitoring and evaluation tool in place for measurement of the things that your organization has done?
Yeah, so for the question on monitoring and evaluation, for the digital accessibility, we are doing a pilot project on a maturity model. So we do have monitoring, more an evaluation tool for understanding a city's digital access. We're piloting that now with Chicago, but also are looking into 5 other pilot cities to use this tool, and really assessing before creating a roadmap for how to create a, let's say, more streamlined 100% or close to 100% accessibility in the city, is really understanding that maturity model in cities and seeing where you are on your ICT accessibility. As far as the Cities for All and the built environment, this is the task for this year. There are really great tools in place, but the one thing we've missed is really engaging the cities so that the tools meet the objectives, because a lot of what's happening at the local level is they want to see exactly how it relates. And if we can get this relatable indicators and work with the cities together, it's a much more streamlined implementation and ensures that their context and also their will really implement this is pushed. So this is some of that what on the built environment that we're working on more for this year, but we already have something in place for the ICT accessibility.
It's Jamie again. I'll open it up for other questions if you do want to add them to that question box. In the interim, I will go ahead and sort of use my moderator's prerogative to pose a question to all of our speakers. I'm very interested in the opportunity of open data for inclusion. I'm reminded of a friend who at one point told me about using OpenStreetMap to identify opportunities to increase the accessibility of his city in Paraguay. So using OpenStreetMap, he was able to identify parts of the city that were not fully accessible, and that initiative made his inclusion experience much more positive. So I'll pose this question to all speakers. Are there particular opportunities to leverage open data to increase inclusion? And related to one of the questions that has been posed by our audience, are there any particular tools for monitoring the impact of these kinds of initiatives? So I'll open it up. Please go ahead.
I'll let Solomon go because I was just talking a lot. I don't want to take too. I'm a little bit Latino, so I don't want to take too much of the.
Hello, can you hear me now? Okay, yeah. So I think yes, when open data provides very good opportunity for the inclusion of persons with disability in terms of the open government partnership. So, for example, in ND Kapadi, one of the commitments that access to information, but there are various levels of access to information because for some of the stakeholders, we want to first know where they can access that information and also how they can interpret the information that is made available. So, for example, if you need information about how much revenues the local assembly has generated over the period, in what form should it be in such a way that you can be able to access and also interpret the data and also make meaningful use of the data to advocate. Another way is that especially for maybe people who are blind, what kind of information tools or how should the information be packaged? So, for example, we are talking about having developed some of the information in bills that people who are blind can also have that kind of access, and also be able to engage with that information, advocate for the right thing. So I believe it is very useful for inclusion of
Wonderful. So it sounds like there could be some very strong opportunities to deepen engagement both of governments and civil society in using open data to advance inclusion purposes. I think we'll move to a question around the role of procurement in advancing accessibility. So specifically the question from our participant Damaris, welcome Damaris, from Hope, is that she's interested in hearing about the procurement pillar within Canada's Bill C-81. So I'll turn to Stephanie to respond to that question.
Sure. Thanks very much for the question, Hope. So in Bill C-81, one of the pillars is, in fact, procurement. And so our component, the work that we're doing in the Government of Canada is helping get the Government of Canada ready for Bill C-81. And so that is one of the pillars of our strategy. And we were interested in a desired state that would be such that all goods and services acquired by the Government of Canada would be accessible by default and have been tested by users with disabilities. So that's what we're working towards, and some of the priorities for action that we've been exploring with people and workshopping are that we could update the Treasury Board Secretariat policy on procurement to include accessibility, and that is work that is underway currently. That we could look at the online system for buying and selling for suppliers and buyers to make that system more accessible for users with disabilities, but also people working on the administration of that system who may have disabilities. So looking to make the online system for acquiring goods and services more accessible. Another priority for action could be to fast track the procurement of necessary equipment, whether it's assistive technologies for employees with disabilities or other kinds of equipment that allow employees to thrive in the workplace and work to their full potential. So sometimes there are delays in the amount of time that it takes to procure an assistive device or a different accommodation in the workplace. So trying to speed up that process. So that is work that is underway. So I hope that captures some of the answers that you might have been looking for. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Federico, it looks like there's a question for you that you might not have addressed yet. So there is interest around cities and whether or not there have been any particular cities that have joined the initiative that you're leading. Would you be able to speak to that?
So yeah, they haven't joined for the initial. It just happened in December, but we did talk to the mayor from Montreal, Valérie Plante. So there is already a discussion, and within the United Cities and Local Governments, we engage with the City of Montreal, and we'll have a retreat coming up in February. So looking forward to finalizing Montreal's involvement in the campaign. And there was a really good interest back when we spoke in July, so I think it'll be a good partnership. And of course, we are open to other cities in Canada. And also another aspect we really want to shine in the campaign is looking at the role of the intermediary and the periphery cities as well. So it would be great to also be in contact with the secondary and periphery cities as well in Canada. Yeah, and I just wanted to mention on one end with this open data, I think there's so much potential in really utilizing this type of data, and especially on our end around accessibility. We work with a lot of networks that have accessibility data that they're using in applications, and creating applications that assess qualitative and also community interactive data on accessibility. One is called Wheelmaps from a group named Sozialhelden here in Germany, and they've actually created the first accessibility cloud. So it really merges different indicators on accessibility that can be interacted in a map. And the idea is to really scale up the initiatives so that in the end we can have an accessible Toronto app or an accessible Montreal app. So whether you're living in the city or whether you're visiting the city, you can have the data on accessibility based on the type of diversity and your mode of mobility and the way you want to engage with the city.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm going to ask one last question before we wrap it up. So to do so, I'll synthesize a couple of questions that have come up in the chat and leverage Joshua's question up there. It sounds like there's sort of an increasing array of technical options and tools available to increase inclusion for people with diverse accessibility needs. So really, as we talk about digital transformation, it seems like it could be a very promising future. It seems at the same time that there could be pitfalls associated with those new tools. And in fact, some of the barriers that we face may be more cultural than technical. So I'd like to invite our three panelists to speak to that challenge. Do you agree with the idea that we need to not just develop technical tools, but also build on the culture? And what steps might we take as members of governments, of civil society, to more effectively overcome those gaps? So Stephanie, could I start with you? And then we'll go to Solomon.
Great. Well, I always love to talk about culture change. It's really an exciting project to be able to work with people online and in person to be able to challenge assumptions around capacities and abilities and the range of experiences that people have over their lifetime and across differences that are sort of anchored in constraints that people may have. So I think that there is a lot of work to be done to change behaviors and to change attitudes. And in the public service, that is work that we are going to be taking on with gusto. I think learning and these kinds of educational fora are really a wonderful way to be a part of changing the culture and inviting different people to come into this culture change project. So people with lived experience of disability working alongside folks who don't have lived experience of disability but who can be effective allies. So I think that culture change, sometimes we think that it can take a very, very long time, but actually I think there are instances in which it takes really a matter of one conversation or one experience where you see a colleague who may be having a barrier and you help solve the problem, overcome that barrier together, and in an instant or in a few days, everything that you do changes from there. So I think that culture change can happen quite quickly. And by creating workplaces that are more inclusive and more accessible, we all can accelerate the pace of culture change and be a part of inclusive and accessible governments. And using, the fluidity of open government is very promising in that regard, I think.
That's wonderful. It's nice to hear such a hopeful tone when it comes to discussion around accessibility. Solomon, did you have views on the question?
For example, in developing countries, there is still technology gaps, there is still capacity and also accessibility gaps. So I think in terms of promoting inclusion, we must always look at the context very well and also look at the accessibility, because in areas that you can fast track the use of digital engagement, then that could be done. But in most cases, access to internet problem, access to even devices that we can use to communicate is also a problem. So I think gradually we would be building the momentum and the capacity of the digital age. But I think for now, we can still be using the traditional ways of engagement, because at the end of the day, one of the key things that we want to achieve is inclusion. So in discussing with the target groups, which are the most appropriate ways for which you will need to receive information, for which you will need
I think we
to be included in open and government processes. And I think
wonderful. Thank you very much, Solomon. I'm sorry, we're running out of time, so I'll turn to Federico. If I could ask you, Federico, to limit your comments to just 30 seconds or so that we can wrap up on time. Over to you.
So I'll do it in 30 seconds. I'm a really fast talker, so this is good. I think that culture is really at the heart of accessibility. You sometimes can have a fully accessible environment, but the culture and the access by people in the environment can limit the accessibility, whether it's how people view you in the workplace, your capacities in the workplace, how people view you also on a social aspect, going out. I think there's so much about persons with disabilities in this kind of leisure that people don't understand. and on that end also older people if we bring in the age dimension. So I think there's a huge way, and there's so many strong steps to cultural inclusion that are out there. And for example, one good thing that comes out is sometimes when you have this hard discussion, when people invite you to an event that's not inclusive. For example, my boss, he's using a wheelchair, and sometimes he gets invited to an event that it's on the 3rd floor, it has no elevator. And people have thought about being inclusive in one aspect, but didn't even think about this other aspect. And instead of, maybe getting angry, he uses it as a time of this, reflection and really creating an open dialogue. And it's led to more inclusive events for whether it's in cinema or whether it's when we're at the UN. So I think really creating a culture of openness to talk about these issues and not being scared to address the questions you have about disability is something that we need to work on. I think it's getting much better. And we need to use the resources we have. There's so much, I know it sounds funny, but YouTube is one of the greatest, I think, visual libraries that we can use also to share this information.
Great note. I hope that you will look to YouTube to see the video of this webinar very shortly with captioning and all of that. Thank you very much, everybody, for your patience with our technical glitches. We very much appreciate you participating in this conversation. Please join us for the next in this inclusion series. It will be on youth, and it will be on February 13th. And we look very much to hopefully seeing many of you engage in conversations on these important topics online, through Twitter, using the hashtag OpenGov, and hopefully at the Global Summit that we'll be hosting in May in Ottawa. Have a wonderful day.